2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Professor John O'Connor with me again. Good morning.
Good morning, Dave.
And you're telling us about a special two-day forum which was held, I think, last week, and it was discussing nuclear energy in Australia.
That's right. It was Thursday and Friday last week in Sydney. It was run by the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, and it was asking the question, nuclear energy for Australia. And so it was an honest broker process. It was really out there to see what are the pros and cons, whether we can rule it out or not. And a lot of people would go, why is Australia even thinking of nuclear energy? But I mean, we've got a lot of coal, but the trouble is the coal is actually, the cheap coal is one of our problems in the sense that, you know, with the greenhouse gas savings we've got to make, unless we can find some way of mitigating that CO2 produced in when we burn coal, then we've got to find an alternative. And many people think of renewable energies, and that's fine. We're making some interesting developments in that area, but unless we can find a way of storing energy through that process, so we can run it on the days where there's no wind or there's when it's cloudy or the long cold nights or whatever, unless we can find great storage methods for that energy we produce, then we need something else to provide backup. And I guess one of the interesting stories is that really if you eliminate any form of energy from the equation, then you're starting to restrict your options. And this had a foresight of looking from now to 2050, and there were some very interesting talks. And of course, people will immediately say, well, what about Chernobyl? What about Fukushima?
Safety in nuclear energy, that'd be a pretty important topic, I imagine. And
it's interesting because there are two issues. One is, in both cases, they were old reactors. And the world's moved on in 40 years. The reactors are different, much safer now than they were. There are actually over 430 operational nuclear reactors around the world. You don't hear about the other 428, but they're working perfectly well. And certainly the newer ones have got, they've learnt from the mistakes of the older ones. So that's one interesting thing. But also people go, well, what about the deaths? And it's interesting, when you compare the number of deaths per unit energy produced, nuclear is actually one of the lowest, which is a surprise because people go, what about Chernobyl? Well, there are many more people killed each year because of the other forms of energy. And in fact, I was surprised to learn that our current forms of energy production cost us about $2 billion a year in health effects. Now, we've got no nuclear here. So those other forms of energy actually have a big impact. And there was an economist there who looked at what would be the consequences of changing over the next 40 years to nuclear as opposed to looking at others. We had someone who's looking at the alternative energies and how the mix would change over the next 40 years to address the greenhouse gas goals that we have. And in the case of the economist, he was able to show that by going to nuclear, you potentially save about $150 billion. And that takes into account all the issues that you might be concerned about. And it would also then meet the goals. In the case of the energy future, it takes out from the energy mix over the next 40 years the things which are currently untested. So in the case of nuclear, that is a tested technology. It's a known quantity. But they also looked, they had people who were talking about the technical aspects. They were looking at the social aspects, what you'd need to do in terms of that. And, many people will say, well, after Fukushima, they've stopped building reactors. Well, they haven't actually. There are a large number of reactors around the world which are under construction and are being planned. So that came as a bit of a surprise to me too, because I'd heard of some countries, like Germany is a classic example. They've wound back their nuclear program. But the consequence of that is that their greenhouse gas emissions risen dramatically, and they currently don't have an alternative. And they relied very heavily on solar, but they're so far north that that's a tough call to try and get energy from solar. So it was an interesting mix. So there was also talk from people who are looking at the renewable energies and what the options there are. Solar. And Australia is really well placed for solar energy, but. And in some areas also for wind energy. But the real trick there is, how do you store that to use at times when the sun isn't shining, and that's an untested technology at this stage.
So, John, over the 2 days and the forum, the get-together, is exploring options for nuclear energy in Australia, was it more favourable?
It's well, certainly it depends on what you set as parameters. I think the big message was, as soon as you start to limit yourself, as soon as you rule something out, you make your job tougher. So the answer wasn't necessarily that it was the answer, but certainly there were very interesting opportunities that were opened. I mean, for my own sake, I'm not an advocate of nuclear energy. I'm an advocate of fusion, which I guess is a form of nuclear energy, but that's a radioactive, safe form of energy. But I think it's something that we've got to keep in mind, because there are various time frames over which we have to work. Between now and 2050, we really do need to cut back our CO2 emission. In fact, there was a very good presentation by the director of the ARC Centre for Climate Change, and that really emphasised the need that we have to cut back now, not in 2050. But yes, we need to do that. Initially, we can do it by energy efficiencies. We can cut things down almost immediately by doing that. In the next short term, we can perhaps start to ramp up some of the alternative energies, but they're a long way behind. They've got a lot of catching up. And they could probably be a dominant part in 2050, but you need something in between. You need something to fill that gap, and it's got to be something that's already tried and tested, not something that is speculative. And so nuclear could do that. From my own perspective, I think the second half of this century is going to be a fusion period, a period where we use fusion energy, which has enormous energy reserves, doesn't have radioactive waste. So I think cutting nuclear out really makes it a tough job between now and the middle of this century.
Well, thank you for telling us about that and giving us a report on that forum which was held last week. John, we'll catch up with you in 2 weeks' time.
Thanks, Dave.
Joining us from the University of Newcastle, the Head of Mathematics and Physical Sciences, Professor John O'Connor. Now 14 to 12 at 2 in URFM 103.7.